Hello, everybody. So for today's video, what we're going to be looking at is 1968, which is in many ways one of the kind of major points of departure, or at least the beginning of a massive transition in American society and politics. It's in many ways a year that changes everything about American society, or at least a whole lot of things. It's oftentimes considered to be the year that really marks the beginning of the United States that we live in today, in some senses of it, usually not in the positive senses. It's a year racked by warfare, division, multiple assassinations, urban riots, political rioting, um, and just massive social and political upheaval. It's also the single deadliest year of the Vietnam War for the United States. During 1968, nearly 17,000 Americans are killed in Vietnam in that one year. To put that in perspective, that is more than the number of Americans that have been killed between 1965 and the end of 1967. So in the space of about a year, you have nearly as many Americans being killed in Vietnam as had died in the war in its entirety up until that point. And that, of course, brings renewed urgency to questions about the war in Vietnam. So that's, of course, going to be what defines the year in many ways, is the war in Vietnam. So this is going to be the first of a two-part video about this. And in this video, we're going to look at the war in Vietnam and how 1968 fundamentally changes the trajectory of America's involvement in that conflict and the meaning of that involvement for the United States going forward. So to start off with, let's look at where things were at the end of the previous year, the end of 1967. Now, by 1967, in spite of the early popular support that the war had enjoyed, following the Congress granting President Johnson near carte blanche powers to wage war in Vietnam via the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, by late 1967, the war was increasingly unpopular. And by the end of that year, a clear plurality of Americans by that point opposed the war. Um, I'm not going to relitigate all the reasons why that is. I've covered that in earlier videos. But suffice it to say, by late 1967, President Johnson's political situation, because of the war, is increasingly rocky. He, of course, had been elected in one of the great landslides, some might say the greatest landslide victory in American political history, winning over 60% of the popular vote in 1964 against Republican Barry Goldwater. But by late 1967, Johnson was increasingly unpopular. He had angered, of course, many young Americans because of his support for the war, a war which many young Americans were too young to vote for. And the way that the war affected certain communities had furthermore eroded support for many of his other signature programs. The way that the war disproportionately affected the African American community ultimately caused significant breaks between Johnson and civil rights leaders, most notably Martin Luther King, who as early as 1965 had begun criticizing Johnson's handling of the war and his decision to focus his attentions on the war rather than on social programs that King believed were essential for both promoting economic and social integration for African Americans, but also more broadly for promoting, the kind of healing vision for the country that he envisaged. In April of 1967, King had gone as far as to call the United States the quote greatest purveyor of violence in the world today in his famous Riverside Church sermon delivered in Brooklyn, New York. So the war brought clear schisms between Johnson and many youthful young Americans because of how they were impacted by the war, and it brought divisions between Johnson and the African American community and civil rights leaders. It had eroded Johnson's support amongst working class communities, white working class communities, steel towns, the urban ethnic enclaves of American cities like St. Louis and Philadelphia and Chicago and elsewhere, because, of course, it was their sons who were the ones who were, by and large, being shipped off to, along with their African American counterparts, being shipped off to the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam. So Johnson's political situation is increasingly tenuous by early 1960, by late 1967, early 1968, and by this point, a plurality of Americans opposed the war. Not quite an outright majority, but a sizable plurality, around 48, 49%. And this extended not just to, people who were affected by the war because of class or racial reasons or both, but also within his own administration. One of the principal architects of the war in Vietnam, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, had himself by 1967 begun privately expressing deep doubts about the likelihood of American victory in the war, or even the moral righteousness of the cause. In a memo to President Johnson that McNamara sent in May of 1967, he said, and I quote, "The picture of the world's greatest superpower killing or seriously injuring 1,000 non-combatants a week while trying to pound a tiny, backward nation into submission on an issue whose merits are hotly disputed is not a pretty one." Just a few months later, McNamara left his job as Secretary of Defense, resigning his post in November of 1967. So by late 1967, early 1968, the public mood is clearly turning against the war in Vietnam. Many of the people who Johnson had relied upon and whose advice had driven him into expanding the American war in the war in Vietnam and turning it into an American conflict, had left the White House, had themselves begun privately expressing grave doubts of the conflict, and had come to the conclusion that it was unwinnable. Yet, up to this point, the public assertions made by Johnson and by American commanders like General William C. Westmoreland continue to stress this idea that there was light at the end of the tunnel, that victory was around the corner, that the Viet Cong insurgency was on the verge of being crushed, and what have you. The lack of truth behind those assertions was graphically laid bare on January the 31st, 1968, when the Viet Cong launched a massive coordinated assault on targets throughout South Vietnam. The period in which this attack occurred coincided with the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday, known as Tet. For years, this had been a period in which there had usually been an informal ceasefire between Viet Cong, NVA, and ARVN troops as they celebrated this traditional Vietnamese holiday. The South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN, as had been the case for years up to this point, basically left their barracks, went to celebrate with their families, and by and large honored the ceasefire in January of 1968. The Viet Cong, however, resupplied with massive amounts of artillery, rockets, and various other supplies from through the Ho Chi Minh Trail from the north, did not. And on March the 31st, 1968, they began staging a series of rapid surprise attacks on American and South Vietnamese installations throughout South Vietnam. These attacks, which involved attacks on 36 of the 44 provincial capitals in South Vietnam, as well as almost all of South Vietnam's major cities, including the capital city of Saigon, completely took both South Vietnamese and American officials in the country completely by surprise. American commanders at the time anticipated that the major focus of any Viet Cong or NVA attack would be near the demilitarized zone that separated North and South Vietnam, where around 6,000 American Marines had come under an intense siege at Khe Sanh. Johnson was absolutely convinced that Khe Sanh and the Marines there were the linchpin of the North Vietnamese military operations, and had even told his commanders, "I don't want no damn Dien Bien Phu," referring to, of course, the French defeat at the siege of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And so he had focused much of the military effort on Khe Sanh, completely neglecting even the likelihood of a renewed Viet Cong assault in other areas of South Vietnam. And so, as a result of this, when the Viet Cong launched their assault on American and ARVN positions in South Vietnam with the launch of the Tet Offensive, they took those forces completely by surprise and initially completely overwhelmed those American and ARVN defenses. In Saigon, the ARVN, a group of Viet Cong infiltrators actually managed to break through and seize part of the U.S. Embassy compound. Um, but there, as in many other areas of South Vietnam, the initial surprise of their attacks was very quickly beaten back by overwhelming American aerial and ground artillery firepower. And in the case of the 19 Viet Cong who managed to infiltrate the American embassy, within a matter of hours, all of them had either been killed or captured by American and ARVN forces. Um, and the same was true in much of South Vietnam. In much of South Vietnam, after the initial shock of the Viet Cong attacks wore off, American and ARVN forces were able to relatively quickly rally and were able to relatively quickly beat back the Viet Cong infiltrators and to inflict ultimately massive, some might even say nearly crippling casualties on the Viet Cong. The only place where the Viet Cong managed to actually hold out for any lengthy period of time was in the ancient Vietnamese capital, the ancient walled city of Hue, where Viet Cong forces managed to occupy the center of the ancient citadel in that city, um, which had been preserved. And they managed to hold out for nearly 4 weeks between January 31st and February 25th, 1968. Um, this would prove to be one of the most gruesome and brutal battles of the Tet Offensive, one that would inflict large casualties on American Marines that were engaged in the fighting, as well as their ARVN counterparts in the city, and which would essentially render much of the civilian population of Hue homeless. Over 100,000 people in Hue saw their homes destroyed as American forces unleashed massive firepower to try to drive out the Viet Cong infiltrators. In the process, the Viet Cong managed to round up and execute between 2,500 and 5,000 um, people within the city of Hue. The exact figure remains unknown. People that had been classified as traitors or enemies of the revolution or what have you. Something which illustrates one of the oftentimes unstated truths of the war in Vietnam, which is that both sides in the conflict committed atrocities. There's a strong tendency in the United States for you know, for understandable reasons to focus on American atrocities, but the Viet Cong definitely committed their fair share of atrocities in the conflict as well. And many of the people in the civilian population of South Vietnam really felt kind of caught between these two opposing forces and really didn't feel like they had any great options dealing with that. So ultimately, the Tet Offensive, from a military standpoint, is a massive failure for the Viet Cong and for the North Vietnamese government. They don't succeed in any of their objectives whatsoever. None of their military objectives are achieved in the Tet Offensive. They don't manage to permanently take any new towns. They don't see the general uprising of the South Vietnamese population that they expected. And the ARVN forces that they expected would quickly wither away and retreat and run away basically in the face of mass enemy fire, by and large held their ground and stood fast, and fought as ably as their American counterparts in resisting the offensive. So from a military standpoint, it's a complete disaster for the North Vietnamese. But politically speaking, it proves to be an even greater disaster for the United States. And the reason is because even though the United States actually manages to win a military victory, a rather substantial military victory, in fact, in the Tet Offensive, the fact of the matter is that two things really. The first is that the Tet Offensive illustrated quite graphically, once again, because of the nightly images from the streets of Saigon, from the ruins of the once beautiful citadel of the ancient city of Hue, and various things like that. The sheer carnage that happened as a result of the Tet Offensive was appalling to many Americans. The images of people lying in the streets with blood, flowing out of their heads, dead bodies everywhere. One of the most iconic, if not horrific, images of the entire war in Vietnam occurs in the midst of the fighting, the brief fighting in Saigon, when a South Vietnamese police general takes at that point, handcuffed and unarmed Viet Cong infiltrator, takes him into the middle of the street and shoots him point blank in the head. An image which was captured both by an NBC nightly news video crew and by AP photographer Eddie Adams. Now, the specific context of that photo, the fact that this person was part of a Viet Cong assassination squad, wasn't really discussed at the time, but the image of this South Vietnamese general taking this very young person into the street, shooting him, right there in the middle of the street in broad daylight, was horrifying to many Americans. And it really raised rather serious questions of, even if we're winning this thing, what kind of people are we supporting in fighting this thing? What kind of regime and what kind of, society are we trying to uphold here? So that's one thing, is just the sheer horror of the images that people saw on the nightly news during the Tet Offensive, which was pretty much nonstop every night. Even the retaking of the American embassy was extensively captured on camera by news crews, and it likewise captured the gory aftermath of overrunning those Viet Cong infiltrators and what have you. Same with the Battle of Hue, and images of wounded and dying American Marines lying in the streets of Hue and what have you. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the speed and ferocity with which the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive completely undermined the central claim that American officials and military commanders had been stating for, by that point, 3 years at that point, that the Viet Cong insurgency was steadily losing momentum, that they were on the verge of defeat, that their morale was collapsing, and that, there was light at the end of the tunnel. Um, the Tet Offensive demonstrated quite graphically that far from being a defeated and spent force, the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies were as, if not more, committed to obtaining victory in the war as they had been at any point. Now, so again, you get an offensive, a battle that, in the strictest military sense, is a massive, um, incredibly lopsided American victory, with American forces, basically wiping out, by some estimates, as much as 90% of the Viet Cong in the months-long operations that followed the Tet Offensive. But public opinion, as a result of the offensive, rather decisively turning against the war. And perhaps the most critical moment in this process of public opinion decisively turning against the war as a direct result of the Tet Offensive came in late February 1968, when CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, who at the time was referred to as the most trusted man in America, or Uncle Walter, by many Americans, went on the CBS Evening News. He had just come back from shadowing American Marines in the Battle of Hue, and he issues a blistering report on the American war in Vietnam and its likely outcome. Um, and he says quite plainly, basically, what we have here is a stalemate. And he urges the United States to, and this is his words, um, you know, we must approach this conflict not as victors, but as an honorable people who pledged to defend democracy and did the best they could. So that moment when Walter Cronkite goes on the air and says those words, basically advocating for a negotiated settlement to bring the war to an end, to bring American troops home, that's a critical moment in the war. President Johnson himself even is reputed to have said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost middle America at that moment. And that brings a series of shocks to the entire political system that in the long run would end up completely upending the, kind of conventional wisdom and the nature of American politics, with effects stretching decades, up to and including the present. Um, just a few weeks after Cronkite went to the national airwaves and issued his, kind of plea to President Johnson and to the American people to see the war as a stalemate and to seek a negotiated settlement. Johnson, who, remember, is the incumbent president at this time, he had won a landslide election in 1964 in his own right. He's challenged by a relatively unknown anti-war senator named Eugene McCarthy in the New Hampshire primary. And in the New Hampshire primary, McCarthy ends up winning 42% of the vote and a majority of the delegates in that primary contest. And so what McCarthy's unexpected victory in New Hampshire convinces Johnson is that politically he's toast. He's done for. There's no way that civil rights activists or student anti-war activists or many other groups that Johnson hoped to win ahead of the 1968 election would vote for him. And so just a few weeks later, after his, the massive political setback that he suffers in New Hampshire, Johnson takes to the national airwaves on March 31st, 1968, and issues a stunning declaration in which he says, I don't think I should spend any more of my time focusing on present-day election campaigns. Therefore, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. He drops out of the race, essentially, stating that he will dedicate himself to seeking a peace treaty, a peace negotiation that will allow the United States an exit from Vietnam for the remainder of his presidency. So with Johnson dropping out of the race, that's just this massive political bombshell that, of course, completely upends the political system and brings about a one of the most dramatic and confrontational political campaigns of all time. An election that would fundamentally remake the rules of American politics, which would showcase stark divisions in American society, and which ultimately would mark the beginning of a new era in American politics. So that's what we'll talk about in the next video.